17 lives were lost. Their deaths seemed random, disconnected, until a single chilling detail brought them all together: the cryptic numbers left behind. Numbers that weren't just meaningless scrawls, but a countdown tied to a man's unrelenting obsession. This is the story of Jacob Trent, a man whose love for numbers became his ultimate downfall, a journey into obsession, fear, and the unthinkable acts he believed would grant him more time. But was he simply mad, or was something else guiding his hand? Welcome to Eerie Road Tales. Tonight, we explore the harrowing case of the Numerical Killer, where logic and horror collide. The story takes us back to the late 1990s, to a quiet and seemingly idyllic suburban town called Westfield. The kind of place where doors were rarely locked, and neighbors greeted one another with warm smiles. Life moved at a predictable pace, steady, uneventful. That's what everyone believed, anyway. But beneath the surface of this peaceful town, a chain of horrifying events was about to unfold, events that would forever shatter its tranquil facade. It all began with a single death. Then another. And another. As the town reeled from the mounting losses, the randomness of the victims left everyone baffled. These weren't connected by family, location, or even circumstance. Each life snuffed out seemed like an isolated tragedy. But as investigators dug deeper, they began to see a faint pattern emerging, a faint thread that linked the unthinkable acts to one man: Jacob Trent. Jacob Trent was the kind of person you wouldn't notice in a crowd. A man of routines, he was often described as quiet, perhaps even unremarkable. He kept to himself, working a steady but unspectacular job as a data analyst. Those who knew him said he was polite, if not a little distant. But there was one thing that everyone agreed on: Jacob loved numbers. From his childhood, Jacob's fascination with numbers had been obvious. Teachers marveled at his natural ability to solve complex equations. While other children played outside, Jacob spent hours poring over math puzzles, scribbling calculations in worn-out notebooks. His passion for numbers seemed harmless, even admirable, but it also made him different. Classmates whispered behind his back, calling him strange. He didn't have many friends and rarely seemed bothered by it. Numbers, it seemed, were his true companions. Neighbors later recalled glimpses of his peculiar behavior. On quiet nights, they'd see the faint glow of his bedroom light, long after everyone else had gone to bed. If they listened closely, they could hear him muttering to himself, his voice low and hurried. He was always talking about patterns, one neighbor said. Patterns in the way the leaves fell, in the way cars passed his house, in the way the stars moved in the sky. For most, it was eccentricity. For Jacob, it was something much more. Jacob's fixation with numbers grew stronger over time. He began to see them everywhere, in the smallest, most mundane details. He kept a diary filled with rows upon rows of calculations, each number meticulously written. It wasn't long before his notebooks spilled over onto the walls of his home. Complex equations stretched from floor to ceiling, scribbled in ink, pencil, and even charcoal. It was as though he was trying to solve a puzzle only he could see. But what no one realized at the time was how deep Jacob's obsession truly ran. This wasn't just a love for numbers. It was something far more consuming. To Jacob, numbers weren't just abstract symbols. They were alive, meaningful, guiding. And then, one night, they spoke to him. In the quiet of his room, with nothing but the hum of the streetlights outside, Jacob claimed he heard a voice. A soft, insistent whisper that wasn't coming from inside his head. No, this was different. The voice had weight, a presence. And what it said changed everything. Your time is running out. At first, Jacob dismissed it. A trick of the mind, he thought, the result of too many sleepless nights. But the whispers returned, more persistent, more precise. The voice gave him a number, a countdown, ticking steadily towards 0. He tried to ignore it, but the numbers were everywhere now. They followed him, haunted him. And with each passing day, the countdown grew louder. It was an ordinary night when everything changed for Jacob Trent. Lying in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling, his mind drifted as it often did, counting cracks in the paint, tracing imaginary lines between them. Numbers were his comfort, his constant. But that night, something broke the silence. It started faintly, almost imperceptible, like a low hum at the edge of his hearing. Jacob sat up, straining to identify the source. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was closer, more intimate, as if it were coming from inside the room, or inside his own head. And then, clear as day, he heard it, a voice. Soft but insistent, it whispered a single phrase, "Your time is running out." Jacob froze, his breath caught in his throat. He sat motionless, listening, hoping it was just his imagination. But the whisper came again, this time with more urgency. It wasn't random. It wasn't vague. It was precise. The voice gave him a number, a countdown. 27 days, it said. Jacob's pulse quickened. He tried to dismiss it as a trick of the mind, the result of stress or exhaustion. But the whispers didn't stop. Over the next few nights, they returned, persistent and clear, repeating the countdown. 26, 25, 24. The numbers were always there, growing louder, more oppressive, until they consumed his every waking moment. Jacob's once orderly life began to unravel. At work, he stared blankly at his computer screen, unable to focus. At home, he paced the floors, his thoughts racing. The whispers haunted him, filling every quiet moment with their relentless ticking. He stopped sleeping. He stopped eating. Friends began to notice his decline. His once polished appearance gave way to disheveled clothes and bloodshot eyes. When asked what was wrong, he would mutter something about numbers, but no one could make sense of it. The whispers soon gave him more than just numbers. They gave him instructions. Clear, direct, and horrifying. They told him there was only one way to stop the countdown, to take a life. At first, Jacob recoiled at the thought. He wasn't a killer. The idea repulsed him. But as the days ticked by and the countdown grew closer to 0, his fear overwhelmed his morality. The whispers became deafening, echoing in his mind day and night, giving him no peace. The whispers weren't content with just counting down. As the days dwindled, they grew more demanding, more forceful. Jacob first heard the command late one night, as he sat alone in his dimly lit living room. The voice was different this time, colder, heavier, and unrelenting. It spoke just 2 words. Take 1. Jacob froze, his breath shallow, his body rigid. He couldn't believe what he'd heard. The numbers had been tormenting enough, but this was something else entirely. He shook his head, muttering to himself, "No, I won't. I can't." He tried to drown out the whispers with noise, turning up the TV, blasting music, even shouting into the void of his empty house. But it didn't work. The voice persisted. The commands became more frequent, interrupting his thoughts and invading his dreams. "Take one," it whispered during the quiet hours of the night. "Take one," it hissed as he walked through the aisles of the grocery store, the sound ringing in his ears above the hum of everyday life. Jacob refused to listen. He was not a killer. He couldn't let himself believe that taking a life was the only way to stop the countdown. As the days crept closer to 0, Jacob's resolve began to waver. He tried everything he could think of to silence the voice. He consulted doctors, claiming he was suffering from severe insomnia, but the sleeping pills only dulled his senses. They did nothing to quiet the whispers. He started researching numerology, hoping to find a hidden meaning in the countdown, some way to break the cycle without resorting to the unthinkable. But every book, every theory, every desperate attempt led him back to the same terrifying conclusion. The whispers wanted blood. By the time the countdown reached 5, Jacob was unraveling. His body trembled from exhaustion, his mind frayed from the relentless torment. He paced his house endlessly, muttering to himself, arguing with a voice. "I won't do it. You can't make me." But even as he shouted his defiance, the weight of his fear bore down on him. What would happen when the countdown hit 0? Would he simply die? Would the whispers consume him entirely? The uncertainty gnawed at him, a darkness pressing on his chest. By 3, Jacob could barely think straight. His hands shook as he stared at the scribbled equations on his walls, searching for a way out, but the numbers offered no answers. The whispers were deafening now, drowning out everything else. "Take one, Jacob," they commanded. "Take one, or you'll have no time left." He clutched his head, rocking back and forth, trying to resist. But the fear of death, the weight of the unknown, it was too much. When the countdown reached 2, Jacob broke. The thought of dying, of being erased without understanding why, was unbearable. He wandered out into the night, his movements slow and hesitant, as though his body wasn't fully his own. In his trembling hand, he carried a wrench, heavy, cold, and unfamiliar. The whispers guided him, leading him to the park near his home. The park was empty, save for a single jogger making their way down the dimly lit path. Jacob's heart pounded as he approached, the whispers urging him forward. Every step felt like a betrayal of everything he'd ever believed about himself. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the stranger or to himself. And then, with one swift motion, he struck. The jogger fell, the sound of the impact echoing through the stillness of the night. Jacob dropped the wrench, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He stumbled back, staring at what he'd done, his mind racing. And then, just as suddenly as they'd started, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, a void where the voice had been. For the first time in weeks, Jacob could breathe. Jacob stumbled home, his hands shaking, his clothes stained with blood. The relief was overwhelming. The whispers had stopped. He could think clearly again. For a brief moment, he believed it was over. But that peace didn't last. Days later, the whispers returned. They came softly at first, like the hum of an old song creeping back into memory. But this time, they didn't start at 27. They started at 20. The numbers were back, ticking down once again, faster this time, as if mocking him for believing he could escape. The realization hit him like a punch to the chest. One life wasn't enough. The whispers demanded more. From that point on, Jacob was trapped in a horrifying cycle. Each time he took a life, the whispers would pause, granting him a few days of silence. But they always returned, louder and more insistent, counting down once more. He began to rationalize his actions, convincing himself that the sacrifices were necessary, that the lives he took were the price he had to pay to keep living. His neighbors noticed the change. The quiet, reserved man they had known was gone. Jacob became reclusive, shutting himself away in his home for days at a time. The once tidy house became a chaotic shrine to his obsession. Walls, furniture, even the floor were covered in numbers, endless strings of calculations scrawled in desperate haste. He stopped going to work, stopped answering his phone. No one knew what had happened to him, and most were too afraid to ask. Jacob's world became smaller and darker with each passing day. He was consumed by the whispers, the countdown, the unbearable need to act before his time ran out. The man who had once found comfort in numbers was now their prisoner, caught in a relentless game he couldn't win. The silence after Jacob's first murder didn't last long. For a few fleeting days, he felt free, as if the weight of the whispers had lifted. But then, as predictably as the sun rising, they returned. The numbers didn't start at 27 this time. They started at 20. The countdown was shorter now, more urgent. Jacob's fleeting relief turned to despair. The whispers hadn't been silenced. They were merely waiting, lurking in the shadows of his mind. The second time, it was easier. The whispers guided him again, directing him to a homeless man asleep on a bench in the dead of night. This time, Jacob didn't hesitate. He struck swiftly, efficiently. The whispers stopped immediately, and the countdown reset. He noticed the pattern. The life he took bought him days, just enough time to think he might find another way to end this nightmare. But the whispers always came back. As the days turned into weeks, Jacob's actions became more calculated. He started to plan his kills, targeting victims he believed wouldn't be missed. Drifters, loners, those who walked the streets at night unnoticed. Each murder felt like a twisted transaction, a life for time, a death for silence. He convinced himself that he was doing what he had to, that this was survival, not cruelty. But deep down, he knew he was losing himself. With every life he took, Jacob became more confident. He learned to move swiftly, to cover his tracks, to blend into the background like he always had. But the numbers grew greedier, demanding more frequent sacrifices. He noticed the countdown shortening, the days slipping away faster. It wasn't enough anymore. No matter how many lives he took, the whispers always came back, louder, more insistent. What Jacob didn't realize was that the police were closing in. The first few murders seemed random, isolated incidents. But as the body count grew, so did the similarities between the scenes. Detectives began noticing a peculiar detail. Each victim had a small note left near their body, marked with a single number scrawled in shaky handwriting. At first, the notes were dismissed as meaningless, the ramblings of a disturbed mind. But then someone noticed the sequence. The numbers were counting down. 17, 16, 15. With each new murder, the pattern became clearer. The investigators were horrified. This wasn't just a string of random killings. It was a calculated, methodical process. The realization sent a ripple of fear through the department. They weren't just dealing with a killer. They were dealing with someone who had a plan, someone who wouldn't stop until the countdown reached its conclusion. By the time the police pieced it together, 17 lives had already been lost. The media dubbed the killer the numerical murderer, and panic spread through the community. Who would be next? What did the numbers mean? The detectives worked tirelessly, poring over the crime scenes, interviewing witnesses, and tracing the patterns. And then, finally, they caught a break. A witness had seen a man lingering near one of the crime scenes, a man who fit Jacob Trent's description. Unaware that the police were closing in, Jacob was spiraling deeper into his own madness. The whispers were relentless now, driving him to the brink. They demanded more, always more. He was exhausted, terrified, and desperate to end the cycle. And so, he hatched a plan, a horrifying final solution that he believed would silence the whispers forever. Jacob decided to carry out a mass killing. He spent days planning every detail, selecting a crowded location where he could take multiple lives at once. The whispers seemed pleased, quieter than they'd been in weeks, as if waiting in anticipation. But Jacob's meticulous nature, the same trait that had helped him evade capture for so long, also became his downfall. He was spotted by a plainclothes officer near the site, acting suspiciously. When the officer approached, Jacob panicked, his carefully laid plan falling apart in an instant. The arrest was chaotic. Jacob fought back, screaming incoherently as officers restrained him. He shouted about the numbers, about the whispers, about how he had no choice. The police found his notes, pages and pages of calculations, scribbled equations, and the countdown meticulously documented. It was all there, laid bare for them to see. During questioning, Jacob's confession was as chilling as it was puzzling. He sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, his hands trembling, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. At first, he refused to speak, staring blankly at the table in front of him. But then, as if the silence became too much to bear, he began to talk. His words came in fragments, disjointed and frantic, as though he was trying to make sense of them himself. "The numbers told me to do it," he said, his voice low and quivering. "They came to me, first in whispers, then in screams. They told me I was running out of time, that I needed to take lives to extend my own." His hands clenched into fists as he spoke, his knuckles white. "Every time I killed, they gave me more days. But it was never enough. They always came back, demanding more." The detectives exchanged uneasy glances. Jacob's words were haunting, but they also sounded like the ramblings of a madman. Still, as he continued, his descriptions were disturbingly detailed. He recounted each murder with precise clarity, the locations, the times, the victims. He spoke as though he was reliving each moment, his voice growing more frantic with every word. "I didn't want to do it," Jacob insisted, his voice cracking. "I fought them, I tried to resist. But when the countdown reached 0, I thought I would die. I could feel it, like something clawing at my chest, suffocating me. I had no choice." He looked up at the detectives, his eyes filled with desperation. "Don't you see? It wasn't me. It was them. The numbers." The detectives pressed him for more details, but his answers only raised more questions. Who or what were the numbers? Was this a delusion born of a fractured mind, or something else entirely? Jacob offered no clarity, only repeating the same chilling refrain. They promised I'd live forever. If I kept killing, they said I'd never die. The confession shook even the most seasoned officers in the room. Jacob's voice carried an unsettling conviction, as though he truly believed every word he said. Yet, the evidence was undeniable. The notes, the patterns, the countdown, it was all real, all tied to him. The court would later declare him legally sane, rejecting his claims of being driven by external forces. But for those who listened to his confession, the question lingered. What if he was telling the truth? As Jacob was led away in handcuffs, he turned to the officers and said one final thing. The numbers aren't finished. They'll find someone else. His words sent a chill through the room, a lingering unease that no one could shake. The case of the numerical murderer remains one of the most unsettling in modern history. 17 lives were lost, each tied to a countdown that ended only with Jacob's arrest. But the questions he left behind continue to haunt those who followed the case. Were the whispers a manifestation of Jacob's broken psyche, or something far more incomprehensible? And perhaps the most terrifying question of all, if the numbers were real, who might they speak to next? Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey into the mind of Jacob Trent, the numerical killer. If you found this story as unsettling and captivating as we did, make sure to subscribe to Eerie Road Tales. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you'll never miss a story that keeps you awake at night. And remember, the scariest horrors aren't always fiction. They might just be waiting around the corner. Stay curious, stay cautious, and we'll see you in the next story.